Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Andrea Akita and I'm a folklorist. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about sleep paralysis. So sleep paralysis is a really interesting phenomenon for a lot of different reasons. So this is, if you've had this experience, it's called a lot of different names, but you might recognize this experience if you've woken up in the middle of the night and you find yourself unable to move or to call out or anything. So a lot of people have this worldwide, about 20 to 30% of people. But one of the first people to really look at it was a folklorist named David Hufford. And Hufford's approach was really, really interesting because he wasn't really looking at it as a way to disprove it. And he was also looking at it as this being a very normal phenomenon. Like this is something that happens to a lot of people. And he was really interested in, well, why does it happen to a lot of people? Is there like a biomedical explanation for it? Is there a cultural explanation for it? Like what's going on with this? And one of the things he did is he actually took it to a lot of people who were psychiatrists and said, hey, if I gave you this list of symptoms, what would you say about this person? And he was really, really disturbed to find out that if you talk about sleep paralysis and all the things that happen during sleep paralysis, a lot of people would actually diagnose this as schizophrenia. It is not schizophrenia. It is a super common thing that happens to people worldwide. So he was really disturbed by that idea that all these people could think that this was a sign of mental illness when it was just this really common things that happens to a lot of people. So he actually started to figure out, well, what are the characteristics of this? And he came up with some primary and secondary characteristics. So in the primary characteristics, these happen almost all the time, and there's a whole list of them. So the first one is this sort of subjective impression of wakefulness. So you know that you're awake when this is happening. This is not a dream. And people always say this when they talk about this. They're like, I'm definitely not dreaming. And they usually have a list of reasons of why they know they're not dreaming, which is another one of the characteristics. So I'll wait on that. Another one is immobility. So most people find that either parts of their body or their entire body are unable to move. So that's a big part of this as well. So you've got that subjective impression of wakefulness, immobility, and then the third one, which I started to get into a little bit when I was talking about the first one, is that realistic perception of your actual environment. So this is where you know you're awake and you actually know what your environment looks around you. So you know what time it is on the clock. You can see things in the room. You know where you are. You have, woken up in the place where you fell asleep. So this is really common as well. And then the last thing that is a primary characteristic is fear. So a lot of people experience fear when this is happening. And a lot of times I describe it as like an intense fear that's sort of beyond any other experience of fear that they've ever had. So that's pretty much in every single account. There's a lot of secondary characteristics as well. So those might be the supine position, so you're laying on your back, sensation or perception of a presence close to you. Some people hear footsteps. Some people feel a really intense crushing pressure on their chest. So they actually feel like something is sitting on their chest or crushing them in some sort of way. Some people actually to the extent where they're having breathing difficulty when this is happening. Some people experience like a tingling sensation in their body. And other people also experience a fear of death. So they actually really relate this to, I felt like I was dying. This is a super interesting phenomenon in a lot of different ways. And if you look at it from a very biomedical perspective, this is where we get the term sleep paralysis. So we very simplified, and I mean very simplified when I say this, explanation of what's happening in your body is essentially that your brain shuts down your body so that you don't act out your dreams. So you've probably all experienced that where you're like laying in bed and you're asleep and all of a sudden like your leg kicks out or something like that and you wake yourself up. That's sleep paralysis not working, if that makes sense. So basically your brain basically just shuts your body down so you don't act out your dreams. So you don't like kick and punch in the air or wake yourself up, right? So your body is just kind of like totally shut down. It doesn't move in that state. And so what's happening essentially in sleep paralysis is that your brain is waking up before your body does. And that's it. So it just takes a little bit of time. So most people report it feels like forever for a lot of people, but it's usually only seconds. Sometimes like up to 10 or 15 seconds, but it doesn't actually take that long for your body to wake up, but it feels like a really long time when you're struggling to move or you feel like you can't move, right? So it's really interesting to kind of think about this and talk about this because there's a lot of other cultural things surrounding this. So one of the big questions that Hufford had was there's no biomedical reason why a lot of people would sense a presence in the room. So why do so many people sense a presence in the room? Like that doesn't makes sense from a biological standpoint. There's nothing that's happening right here that would make your brain do this. People in sciences have explained this as, oh, it's just a dream. And it's like, yes, except for the fact that people know that they're awake, right? So it's definitely not a dream that's not happening. It's not, some people refer to it as a hallucination. That's, that's when we start to get into some of the language that I don't really appreciate, because I think that's when we start to diagnose this as a mental illness when it's a really, really common thing that happens. So Hufford was really especially interested in this from the standpoint of, does this happen to people because they hear the story, or is the experience come first? And that's what he called the cultural source versus the experiential source hypothesis. So in the cultural source hypothesis, you basically hear the story first and then you have the experience. So you have the experience because you've heard the story, or you at least have a way of categorizing that experience in your head once it happens to you, because your culture actually has this kind of happen. So for a lot of people, they really, really thought for the longest time that people are only having this experience because there's a story in the culture that they grew up in that talked about these things. So of course you would eventually just have one. However, Hufford found that there's a lot of people that were having this experience and they had no story for it. They had no name for it. They didn't know what was happening. In a lot of cases, they actually kind of started to think they were going crazy. And they weren't. They were just having this common experience. So that actually falls more under the experiential source hypothesis, which is that the experience comes first and then the stories come later. So for some people, it's a combination of the two, right? They might have heard these stories before and then kind of forgotten about them, and then they have the experience and they remember the stories again. Some people hear the stories and then have the experience, and some people don't have any connection at all with a story or a name or anything for this. They just have the experience. So Hufford kind of showed that this is definitely something that you can have an experience with without having any story, but that it's certainly possible that you could have a story and then have the experience as well. So that's really, really fascinating to think about this. And this was something that a lot of people really didn't talk about because they didn't feel comfortable talking about it, and they didn't realize how common it actually is. So it's a really fascinating study, and you definitely should read it because it is really interesting, and he has done so much work on it. The book is a little bit older, but I think it's definitely worth your while to read it. Some other things too that he kind of realized from this was that supernatural experience really is based on accurate observation, and it's interpreted rationally by people, right? So it's not just like you just wake up after having an experience like this and you run and tell everybody, right? You have accurately figured it out. You've talked about it like with yourself more so than out loud, although you might eventually get to the point where you talk about it with other people. But you're also like interpreting it. So there's an interpretation process as well. So when you have an experience like this, you might not tell people right away, or you might tell one or two trusted people before you start telling other people. Or, you might go someplace like the internet and read about it or learn more about it from others before you go around and actually telling people about it. So it's not like you just blindly believe these things. You don't just wake up and you're like, well, now it's ghosts, You actually like have a process of thinking about that, which is so important because some people tend to think that supernatural belief is irrational. It's not irrational. Actually, there's a lot of logic and rationality applied to it. People think about it. They don't just tell their stories to just anybody. They know that these stories can be really, really stigmatizing. He also kind of, and this is directly from his work, events which were accurately observed and reasoning which can be properly carried out are central to the development and maintenance of folk belief, even when those beliefs appear fantastic. So we have these things, we observe them, and they contribute to that maintenance of folk belief. So it's not just the stories, it's also the experiences that actually come together and create the folk belief. So I think that's really, really important information to have, and I think it's really interesting to talk about, especially as something that is the intersection of belief and medicine in the field of folklore.